Seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. Theodosius Dobzhansky. Welcome to the GigabyteSpyder podcast, where I talk about anything I want to talk about. Today I thought I'd talk about one of my favorite areas of science by sharing 5 things about the science of biological evolution. The goal is to illustrate why I personally find it so fascinating, and in the process maybe inspire you, my listeners, to find some appreciation in it as well, all in the effort to foster a wider appreciation for the scientific study of living things and for nature itself. First, a few disclaimers. I'm not a professional biologist nor a highly credentialed academic in any field. I don't claim to be an expert, but EvoBio was and continues to be a favorite topics of science for me, and I take a lot of pride in understanding evolutionary principles and communicating them to lay folks. As an avid science advocate and communicator, I want to help bridge the knowledge gap between the accomplished academics and the unknowing public, and this episode serves as a broad introduction to the huge field of evolutionary biology, and it would take a whole series of episodes just to get the full breadth and depth of the science. Of course, anything I say here, as in any other podcast episode, is open for scrutiny, and everyone is free to contribute to a respectful discussion if they feel so inclined. As we shall see, however, foundational ideas like those guiding evolutionary theory are now at this point considered indisputable facts and nearly incontrovertible with the evidence at present. Number 1. The study of evolutionary change isn't separate from the other fields of biology, but it instead unifies all the fields of biology. What this means is that any and all observations in the study of living things can be placed in the context of evolutionary theory. This can range from the large-scale effects of certain biochemical reactions, to the content and function of entire genomes, to the behavior of animals and other organisms, to the physics of different modes of locomotion, to the development of animal embryos, to the modern distribution of species worldwide, and to the study of extinct species. In other words, all of the observations and studies made by biochemists, geneticists, ethologists, biophysicists, embryologists, biogeographers, and paleontologists can all come together to form a comprehensive understanding of not only why and how biodiversity arises and changes over time, but also the natural history of Earth since life began. Number 2. The theory of evolution plays a major part in our modern global and sustainable civilization. Evolutionary changes are known to affect the characteristics of living things by specific mechanisms, so having that knowledge has guided hugely beneficial changes in a wide variety of industries. In agriculture, evolutionary theory guides practices like the creation of GMOs. Not only can farmers and biotechnologists produce crops that naturally repel pests instead of having to rely on harmful pesticides, but they can also produce livestock that are resistant to certain diseases or are able to digest certain diets more readily. This in turn means higher efficiency and lower costs for everyone involved. In fact, evolutionary principles are paramount in producing meat products in a laboratory setting, and if this practice gets widely accepted as a replacement for meat farming, it will go a long way in reducing carbon emissions and abating animal welfare concerns. In medicine, evolutionary theory is crucial to understanding antibiotic resistance in bacteria and the constant evolution of viruses, so that effective antibiotics and vaccines can be manufactured every year. Even in the technology sector, evolutionary theory has been the inspiration for evolutionary algorithms, which has greatly advanced the programming of AI, the testing for optimal engineering designs, and especially the modeling of biological processes that can't be observed firsthand within one human lifetime. None of these industrial advances would be possible if evolutionary theory wasn't as prevalent of an idea as it is now, and the fact that the theory has these practical applications in our daily lives is a testament for how accurate it really is in describing certain aspects of the natural world. Number 3. Evolutionary theory has been instrumental in discovering more about nature than previously thought possible. Due to the ideas behind evolutionary theory, many new extinct species have been discovered in the last couple centuries. Scientists have been able to deduce the appearance of certain hypothetical species in the distant past, and these deductions have been vindicated in a wide variety of organisms. Tiktaalik, for example, was an ancient amphibious vertebrate that was predicted to have appeared in the Devonian period because only vertebrate fish existed before then, and tetrapod vertebrates existed only after then. In 2004, the rocks in Greenland with the right age and rock type yielded an amphibious fish with fully movable neck, signs of using lungs, and front limbs with a skeletal configuration that matched our own.
What inspires me is this transition from life in water to life on land. It is not just some esoteric twig on the evolutionary tree. It's very important for us. It's very important because this event is part of our own evolutionary history when our common ancestor was a fish. So that this proto-wrist we see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its evolutionary cousins, something that became our own wrist. This neck that we see for the first time in Tiktaalik and its evolutionary cousins is something that was to become our own necks. Inside our organs, inside our genes, inside our cells, carry artifacts of the history of life, carry events like this, of which this is just one of countless events in the last 3 billion years.
Perhaps more compellingly, fossils of early human and pre-human species have been uncovered in exactly the right places and time periods that evolutionary scientists have been predicting long before the fossils were found. The earliest bipedal apes, arguably our own direct ancestors, were found in East Africa, within rocks that dated after humans and chimps are believed to have already diverged. These ancient apes possessed the proportions of a chimpanzee, but had human-specific traits, like the smaller pelvis, feet where the big toe doesn't act like a thumb, and a skull where the spine attached from the bottom instead of from behind.
I'm Donald Johansen, and I'm founding director of the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University. The discovery of Lucy, and she belongs to her own unique kind of human. Modern humans are Homo sapiens. We're supposed to be intelligent or wise men. And Lucy belongs to a completely different group of early humans that were walking upright, but had, as you can see here, relatively small brains the size of a chimpanzee, for example. She wasn't a chimp because she was walking upright like we do. And she belongs in a genus named Australopithecus, and she was given her own species name, Afarensis, after the Afar region. And what she did was she provided a very important bridge, I hesitate to use the word link, but bridge between much more ape-like ancestors that had very projecting faces and were very ape-like in their anatomy, to something that was still certainly looks like somewhat like an ape with a projecting face like this and small brain, but this was perched on top of a body that walked like we do on 2 legs, which is very, very unique. So she provided a very important link, bridge between something more ancient and something more modern.
Australopithecus and other extinct bipedal apes show that our human traits are not at all impossible to have evolved naturally. In addition to predicting the when and where of species past, questions about the genetic similarities between various species have also been able to be investigated. Thanks to evolutionary theory, we can be curious about how a species' genome and gene pool has changed over time, and what this means for its relationship with the rest of Earth's biosphere. For example, the common ancestry between megabats and microbats was once hotly debated. Scientists were unsure of whether to classify them as separate families, or even if they came from a common ancestor that maybe wasn't even a bat itself. Some scientists also argued that bats had to be closely related to primates or rodents due to their skeletal and physiological morphology. Today, due to our understanding of how genomes change over time, we know that both megabats and microbats do come from one bat ancestor, and that they're actually more closely related to shrews, hedgehogs, pangolins, hyenas, and ungulates than they are to mice or primates. Another example is when genetics revealed the relationship among arthropods like crustaceans, insects, and myriapods. It was originally thought that insects and other hexapods were more related to myriapods, that's the centipedes and millipedes, than they were to crustaceans like crabs and shrimp. Molecular genetics revealed that some crustaceans, like fairy shrimp, were more related to insects than they are to other crustaceans. This means that insects must come from a crustacean ancestor, which then means that insects are themselves crustaceans. This kind of revelation is exactly how genetics is rewriting and bringing to focus all areas of the evolutionary tree of life. One last example of how molecular genetics is helping to understand evolutionary relationships is how useful it is in approaching hugely diverse groups, like birds. The insane amount of biodiversity just within modern birds would be a huge headache to explain without having some evolutionary framework to work with. One of the best papers I've read about the phylogenetics of modern birds was published in 2014, linked below, where it was determined that at least 36 distinct lineages of birds evolved just within 10 to 15 million years after the Cretaceous extinction event. Due to many of these birds' lifestyles, we would have a hard time finding a complete fossil record for every lineage, so having an approach to genetics based on evolutionary theory could give us answers about just how diverse birds are and how their genetics has changed over time. On a more foundational level, the act of trying to understand how a sequence of molecules come together to build a single organism, as well as trying to understand the environmental constraints needed to diversify a species, both illustrate how exactly evolution is intertwined with the presence of biological blueprints and the history of a species. In the lab, bacteria have been witnessed to evolve specifically to metabolize the man-made material known as nylon. These bacterial colonies have evolved to use new proteins, collectively called nylonase, by capitalizing on mutations that ended up making completely new digestive enzymes. These mutations are believed to have randomized the genes for enzymes already used, yet this randomization still resulted in new enzymes that weren't just functional, but advantageous. This in turn means that novel mutations in certain genes, no matter how small, can lead to beneficial effects for the species on a bigger scale. In other laboratory experiments, genes and other areas of the genome have been manipulated in various ways in various organisms in order to figure out their function. Fruit flies, for example, taught us that there are genes that help make subtle but specialized differences in repetitive body parts. If we muck with these genes, we might end up with a fly with legs in place of its antenna, because legs and antennae are mere variations of the same genetic blueprint. Pigs taught us that we can take genes from one species, like those controlling fluorescence in jellyfish, insert it into a whole other species that doesn't need it, like a pig, and still end up with a perfectly functional organism, even if it ends up having glowing snouts and hooves. Lastly, sheep taught us that if we muck with the areas of the genome that affect the genes around them, we could disrupt the normal distribution of body parts in the organism, resulting in cyclopic deformities. In this case, they also taught us that environmental conditions can certainly have an effect on gene activation. All of these genetic experiments and investigations contribute to explaining why embryos of a certain species grow limbs and other physiological features early in development, but then rescind these features before the creature is fully developed, like when bird embryos show teeth, snake embryos show legs, or ape embryos show tails. In the field, ample observations of speciation have been made, from those just recently split due to natural environmental causes to those produced specifically by human activity. There's a review article from the Royal Society that I'm linking below that reviews many of the ways by which humans have been directly responsible for inducing evolutionary change in a variety of populations. So, from all of this, in helping us to understand geologic time in order to find fossils with specific traits, in helping us to settle debates about taxonomy, in helping us to show how genes and genomes work, and helping us to show how human activity has affected other species, evolutionary theory turns out to be incredibly instrumental in our ability to investigate how biology works at all levels and reconstruct natural history. Imagine what we wouldn't know today if evolution was never a thing. Number 4. Evolutionary theory provides a strictly evidence-based insight about more abstract questions that we once thought were completely unanswerable by science. These questions might include where we as a species ultimately came from, why we think or act the way we do, including cooperation, where consciousness arises from, where intelligence comes from, and perhaps more. Our more recent human ancestors, living before the modern day, looked to ancient stories and imagination to save off their immense curiosity that we still have, Today we have one more way of getting at these age-old questions, now with a more unbiased and evidence-based methodology. Of course, being rooted in science, evolution can only answer these questions on the physical level. It certainly can't tell us if something metaphysical or supernatural exists, or if there's life after we die, but insofar as physical evidence leads us, evolutionary theory is crucial in understanding the mechanics and the natural history of ourselves, the Earth, and perhaps other Earths in our observable universe.
The idea of a designer is an appealing and altogether human explanation of the biological world. But as Darwin and Wallace showed, there's another way. Equally human, and far more compelling.
Natural selection, which makes the music of life more beautiful as the eons pass.
And lastly, number 5, evolutionary theory keeps us thinking. As a product of solely scientific reasoning, the theory of evolution doesn't have the answers to everything, but it does offer us a toolkit of facts and methods that help us investigate a huge fraction of our innate curiosity about the natural world. It continues to expand in implication and accuracy as a way to seamlessly piece together new and ever-changing ideas about biology. As a theory, evolution has incredible power to unify the little bits of knowledge into a bigger and more cohesive picture of understanding. Yet still, also as a product of scientific reasoning, it leaves itself open to being disproved by a better, more comprehensive idea. This new idea must not only explain everything that evolutionary theory currently explains on the same level of detail, but this new idea must also go further and enable us to be curious about things that we could not investigate previously. This is what happened when Einstein's theory of general relativity replaced Newton's law of universal gravitation. The ideas that Einstein brought forth about the behavior of spacetime, with all the necessary evidence and mathematics, enabled us to be curious about the properties of space that would never have been possible had Newton's original law remained upheld. We wouldn't today have GPS technology, satellites, and other technological advances without this new paradigm of physics. Ever since the mid-1800s, and especially after the discovery of genetics, evolutionary theory has likewise opened our minds to new heights of curiosity about biology previously considered impossible, and the possibility that it could be replaced by an even better idea that will expand our knowledge to an even greater degree keeps us thinking hard about how nature works and its history.
Evolution is the big idea in biology, and life is, of course, the big experiment on Earth. So there's really no bigger idea to get your head around. And for those of us who spend a couple of decades trying to understand what individual organisms do, what species are, how they change, what are their relationships to each other, it's a very large and still expanding subject.
Evolutionary theory today remains the most comprehensive and continually expanding explanation for why and how biodiversity exists and changes over time. Just as cell theory and germ theory are to medicine, as atomic theory is to chemistry, and as plate tectonic theory is to geology, evolutionary theory is foundational in our understanding for why living things look the way they look, act the way they act, live the way they live, and what their role is in the history of biology on our planet. Ultimately, evolution is how we, as naturally curious creatures, can attempt to understand our place in our shared natural world. Thank you for listening to this episode of the GigabyteSpyder podcast. I think I've realized now that this podcast is just an excuse for me to geek out about my favorite things under the guise of quote-unquote education. But still, I'm curious to know your thoughts. Is this a topic that resonates with you as well? Is evolutionary theory as fascinating to you as it is to me? Or is it complete hogwash and needs to be thrown out? Let's have a discussion. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to stay updated on future episodes. On this podcast, I also like to talk about topics in photography, linguistics, social relationships, therapy, and other things that reflect my personal variety of interests. You can follow the show on Instagram as well as my personal Instagram profile if you like photos of animals with fun facts. Feel also free to drop suggestions for future episodes, and I always welcome feedback about the format of my show since I'm still just making this up as I go along. I'll leave you with the final words from Darwin's Origin of Species from a fantastic documentary series by PBS that I'll also link in the description.
There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone
cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.